Imagine you are a woman in 1860. You are educated. You own property. You have opinions your husband does not share. Now imagine that this morning a sheriff arrived at your front door, and by this afternoon, you are locked inside an asylum. No judge heard your case. No doctor examined you. Your husband signed one piece of paper, and the law says that is enough. Your crime was not madness. It was independence. And while you sit behind barred windows, your inheritance, your property, your children, all of it passes into the hands of the man who put you there. This is not fiction. This happened to hundreds of American women, and the ones who survived have a story the Gilded Age tried to bury. Chapter 1. The Law That Made Wives Disappear. In 1851, the state of Illinois passed a law containing 14 words that would destroy the lives of countless women. Those 14 words were buried inside a longer statute governing the administration of state hospitals. They did not announce themselves as a weapon. They read, in the dry language of legislative drafting, that a married woman could be committed to an asylum without the evidence of insanity required in other cases. That was all it took. 14 words, no hearing, no medical examination, no right of appeal. A husband could sign a single document, and his wife would vanish behind the walls of an institution from which she had no legal power to free herself. To understand how this was possible, you have to understand coverture. It was the legal doctrine inherited from English common law that said a married woman had no separate legal existence from her husband. She could not own property in her own name. She could not sign contracts. She could not file a lawsuit. She could not testify in court against her spouse. In the eyes of the law, she was not a person. She was an extension of a man. And this meant something very specific when it came to money. If a woman inherited a fortune from her father, it belonged to her husband the moment she married. If she earned wages, they were his. If she owned land, he controlled it. The law did not merely favor husbands, it erased wives, and the asylum was the final instrument of that erasure. Because if a husband wanted full, uncontested control of his wife's property, if he wanted to silence her objections, end her interference, remove her from the household without the scandal of divorce, the asylum offered a solution that was clean, legal, and permanent. The system ran on money. Private asylums charged families weekly fees that could reach $10 to $15, the equivalent of several $100s today, to house patients. State institutions depended on legislative appropriations that grew with patient counts. Asylum superintendents had every financial incentive to accept new patients and very little incentive to release them. The trade in lunacy, as critics would later call it, was a profitable enterprise built on the bodies of women who had no voice to object. By 1860, the scale of this system was staggering. The Illinois State Hospital for the Insane at Jacksonville held 231 patients crammed into 8 overcrowded wards. Another 240 sat on a waiting list. Across the country, the number of institutionalized Americans had grown from fewer than 2,000 in 1840 to more than 8,000 by 1860. A substantial but unknown percentage of these patients were women committed by husbands, fathers, or brothers without any independent medical evaluation. The procedure was efficient. A husband would visit the family physician. He would describe his wife's behavior in whatever terms he chose. The physician would write a brief assessment. The husband would deliver this assessment to the county authorities, who would issue a commitment order. The sheriff would arrive at the woman's door. She would be transported to the nearest asylum. The entire process could be completed in a single day. No lawyer was involved. No advocate appeared on the woman's behalf. No one asked for her side of the story. The architecture of the asylum itself told you everything about its purpose. High walls, barred windows, locked wards, no telephone, no telegraph access, no right to send or receive mail without the superintendent's approval. Once inside, a woman was cut off from every person and every legal mechanism that might help her. The gates closed, and the world outside forgot she existed. She was, in the fullest sense of the word, buried alive. The men who ran these institutions understood their role perfectly. Asylum superintendents were not rebels or outlaws. They were respected members of the medical establishment. They attended conferences, they published papers, they sat on state commissions, and they accepted patients they knew were sane because the law told them to and the fees kept the lights on. The relationship between the family physician, the husband, and the asylum formed a triangle of power that no woman could break from inside. You needed someone on the outside willing to fight for you, and most women had no one. And in 1860, in the small town of Kankakee, Illinois, a 43-year-old minister's wife was about to discover exactly how this machine worked. Chapter 2. The Doctor Who Came Disguised as a Salesman. Elizabeth Packard was folding laundry when a stranger knocked at her door, introduced himself as a sewing machine salesman, and began asking her very unusual questions. The man was not selling sewing machines. His name was Dr. J.W. Brown, and he was the Packard family physician. He had been sent by Elizabeth's husband, the Reverend Theophilus Packard, to assess her sanity without her knowledge. He arrived at the front door of their home in Montano, Illinois, on a spring morning in 1860, and he lied about who he was. He wanted to observe her in her natural state. He wanted to catch her being mad. Elizabeth was not mad. She was opinionated. She was 43 years old, the mother of 6 children, and the wife of a man who preached a strict Calvinist theology that she had come to reject. Her crime, the thing that had pushed Theophilus to this point, was simple. She had started attending a different church. She had spoken openly in Bible class about her belief in religious tolerance. She had told other women in their community that she disagreed with her husband's sermons. In Kankakee in 1860, for a minister's wife, this was an act of war. Elizabeth Packard was not a woman who had suddenly lost her mind. She was a woman who had gradually found it. She had been raised in a strict religious household, married young, born 6 children, and spent the first 2 decades of her marriage in quiet compliance. But something had shifted in her 40s. She had begun to read beyond the confines of her husband's library. She had encountered ideas about individual conscience, about the right of every person to seek God in their own way, about the moral obligation to question authority. These were not radical ideas. They were the ideas that had founded the nation. But in the parlor of a Calvinist minister, spoken by his wife, they were incendiary. Theophilus had warned her. He had told her that if she did not stop expressing these opinions, he would have her committed. She did not believe him. She could not imagine that the law would allow it. But the law not only allowed it, the law was designed for exactly this purpose. Dr. Brown spent a short time in the Packard home. His report was devastating in its simplicity. He noted that Elizabeth exhibited a great dislike toward him during their conversation. He recorded that she had complained about her husband's domination of the household. He observed that she held religious views that differed from her husband's. That was the diagnosis: dislike, complaint, and disagreement. In the medical vocabulary of 1860, these were symptoms. A woman who argued with her husband was exhibiting excitement. A woman who resisted his authority was showing derangement. A woman who held her own religious beliefs was suffering from monomania. Armed with this assessment, Theophilus Packard moved quickly. On June 18, 1860, the county sheriff arrived at the Packard home. Elizabeth had been getting her children ready for the day. The sheriff told her she was to come with him. She asked on what authority. He told her that her husband had signed the commitment papers. She asked to see a judge. The sheriff told her no judge was required. The children watched as their mother was taken from the house. The youngest were crying. Elizabeth kept her composure. She asked the sheriff if she could bring a change of clothes. He said yes. She packed a small bag. He kissed her children and walked out the front door. The Jacksonville Insane Asylum was 90 miles south. The journey took most of a day by wagon and rail. Elizabeth rode in silence, flanked by the sheriff and an attendant. She watched the flat Illinois prairie pass outside the window. She thought about her children. She thought about the home she had been pulled from. She thought about the fact that, under the law of this state, she had fewer rights than a convicted criminal. A criminal was entitled to a hearing. A criminal could face his accuser. Elizabeth Packard, guilty of nothing but holding opinions, had been given no hearing at all. When she arrived at Jacksonville, she was processed like cargo. She was assigned a ward number, given institutional clothing, and locked inside. The door closed behind her. She would not walk through it again for 3 years. Theophilus immediately assumed control of her property, her money, and the household. Under the law of coverture, everything she had brought into the marriage was already his. But her commitment solved a different problem. It silenced her. It removed her from the community where she had been speaking freely. It ended the embarrassment of a minister whose wife publicly disagreed with his theology. The cost of her imprisonment was approximately $4 per week, paid to the state of Illinois. Theophilus considered it money well spent. But inside the walls of Jacksonville, something was about to happen that no one had planned for. Elizabeth Packard was not the kind of woman who sat quietly and accepted her fate. She was the kind of woman who studied the battlefield, and the battlefield was about to teach her everything she needed to know. Chapter 3. 3 years behind barred windows. Inside the Jacksonville Asylum, Elizabeth Packard discovered something the doctors never intended her to see. She was not the only sane woman on her ward. The realization came slowly. Elizabeth arrived at Jacksonville expecting chaos, expecting the howling and violence that the popular imagination associated with asylums. What she found was different. Her ward held women who were quiet, coherent, and desperate. They spoke in full sentences. They described their lives before commitment with clarity and detail. They cried not from madness, but from the perfectly rational grief of women who had been stolen from their homes and children for offenses that had nothing to do with mental illness. One woman had been committed for disagreeing with her husband about money, another for refusing to attend his church, a third for what the doctors called excessive reading, a fourth for expressing great distaste for her husband. A fifth had simply told her husband she wanted a divorce, and he had responded by signing the papers that put her in this place. Elizabeth recognized the pattern almost immediately. These women had not lost their minds. They had lost their obedience, and the asylum was the place where disobedient women were sent to be broken. The daily reality of the institution was designed to grind resistance into dust. The wards were overcrowded. The air smelled of carbolic soap and unwashed bodies. Light came through barred windows that turned the Illinois sunshine into a grid of shadows on the floor. Women slept in narrow iron beds pushed so close together that turning in the night meant brushing the arm of the patient beside you. Meals were served at fixed hours, the food bland and often cold, eaten in silence under the watch of attendants who noted every word spoken and reported it to the doctors. The methods of breaking were systematic. Doctors questioned Elizabeth regularly, pressing her to renounce her religious views and submit to her husband's authority. When she refused, the questions grew more aggressive. When she still refused, the punishments began. The standard toolkit of the mid-19th century asylum was not designed to cure illness. It was designed to produce compliance. Chloroform and ether were administered to women deemed boisterous. Straitjackets were applied as routine treatment for disobedience. Cold water was poured over patients who would not stop talking. In the most extreme cases, documented in the medical notes of the period with a casualness that reads today as horror, women were subjected to surgical mutilation. Contemporary medical journals recorded cases of clitoridectomy performed on women whose offenses included serious reading, expressing religious opinions, and displaying great distaste for her husband. The doctors who performed these procedures wrote about them as clinical triumphs. Elizabeth endured 3 years in this environment. She was not subjected to the worst physical abuses, but she was confined, monitored, interrogated, and denied her freedom every single day. She slept in a narrow bed in a ward with barred windows. She ate what the institution provided. She wore what the institution allowed. She was told when to rise and when to sleep, when to speak and when to be silent. But Elizabeth Packard was fighting a war, and she chose her weapons carefully. She wrote. She wrote in secret, hiding her documents in places the staff would not think to search. She tucked pages into the linings of her clothing. She hid them beneath her mattress. She passed them to sympathetic attendants. She kept a detailed record of everything she witnessed, the names of the women on her ward, the reasons they had been committed, the treatments they endured, and the words of the doctors who kept them confined. The asylum superintendent, Dr. Andrew McFarland, was a problem she studied with particular care. McFarland was a respected figure in American psychiatry, a man who sat on national boards and published in medical journals. He was also, as Elizabeth discovered through careful observation and strategic conversation, a man who knew perfectly well that many of the women on his wards were not insane. His own records, the notes he kept on individual patients, repeatedly stated that Elizabeth showed no signs of insanity. He wrote that she was intelligent, articulate, and rational, and he kept her locked up anyway. The scale of what she documented was overwhelming. In the 3 years she spent at Jacksonville, she filled hundreds of pages. She recorded not just her own story, but the stories of dozens of other women. She built, without knowing it, the evidence file that would eventually blow the system apart. But the system was not finished with her yet. In 1863, after 3 years of confinement, the asylum declared Elizabeth Packard incurably insane. This was not a death sentence. It was something stranger. It meant she would be released, not because she was well, but because the institution had given up on fixing her. She would be returned to the custody of her husband, and Theophilus Packard had plans for the wife he had put away. Chapter 4. 7 Minutes to Freedom. When Elizabeth Packard was finally brought before a jury in January 1864, The 12 men who would decide her fate took exactly 7 minutes to reach their verdict. But before that verdict, before those 7 minutes that would become the most famous 7 minutes in American legal history, Elizabeth had to survive what happened after the asylum released her. In the autumn of 1863, she was returned to Theophilus. He met her at the door of their home in Kankakee. He did not welcome her. He did not embrace her. He walked her inside, took her upstairs to the nursery, and locked the door behind her. Then he went downstairs, found a hammer and nails, and sealed the windows shut. Elizabeth Packard, declared incurably insane by the state of Illinois, was now a prisoner in her own home. The room was small. The windows would not open. The door was locked from the outside. Theophilus brought her meals and left them at the threshold. He did not speak to her. The children were told their mother was too sick to see them. Elizabeth had one advantage that Theophilus had not counted on. She had a window. It was nailed shut, yes, but it faced the street. And she had paper. She wrote a letter. She folded it small and tight. She pushed it through the gap between the window frame and the sill. It fell to the ground below. A friend found it. That friend delivered the letter to Judge Charles Starr. And Judge Starr did something that no one in Elizabeth's life had done for 3 years. He listened to her. Starr issued a writ of habeas corpus, the ancient legal tool that requires a jailer to produce a prisoner before a court and justify the imprisonment. Theophilus Packard was ordered to bring his wife to the Kankakee County Courthouse. He had no choice but to comply. The trial of Packard versus Packard opened on January 11, 1864, and it became the most closely watched legal proceeding in the state. Newspapers from Chicago to Springfield sent reporters. The courtroom was packed every morning, with spectators standing along the walls and crowding into the corridor outside. The question before the jury was narrow but explosive. Was Elizabeth Packard insane? Theophilus hired physicians who testified with great confidence that she was. Their evidence was her religious opinions. She believed in the Holy Spirit, they said, and this belief was evidence of monomania. She disagreed with Calvinist doctrine on infant damnation. She had expressed the view that women had the right to think for themselves. One doctor testified that her excitement when discussing religion was a symptom of mental disease. Another testified that any woman who persistently defied her husband's authority was exhibiting signs of disordered thinking. The medical witnesses spoke with the certainty of men who believed their authority was beyond challenge. Elizabeth's allies called witnesses of their own. Neighbors took the stand and described her as perfectly rational, a good mother, an intelligent conversationalist, a woman who ran her household with competence and raised 6 children without complaint. They described social visits, church gatherings, and dinner conversations in which Elizabeth had been articulate, warm, and entirely sane. A theologian testified that her religious views were not only reasonable, but were shared by many educated Europeans and Americans. They were mainstream Protestant opinions, he explained. They were not evidence of madness. They were evidence of a thinking mind. The jury watched. They listened. They saw Elizabeth Packard sitting in the courtroom, composed, alert, answering questions with precision. They saw Theophilus, rigid and angry, insisting that his wife's refusal to share his beliefs proved her insanity. On January 18, 1864, after 5 days of testimony, the case went to the jury. 12 men filed out of the courtroom. 7 minutes later, they filed back in. The foreman stood and delivered the verdict. "We, the undersigned jurors, are satisfied that Mrs. Elizabeth P.W. Packard is sane." The courtroom erupted. Elizabeth Packard was free. The law had spoken. She was not insane. She had never been insane. 3 years of her life had been stolen on the basis of a lie, and the lie had been exposed before the entire state of Illinois. But freedom, as Elizabeth quickly discovered, was a word with limits. She returned to her home in Kankakee to find it empty. Theophilus had moved fast. While she sat in the courtroom winning her case, he had rented their house to strangers. He had sold her furniture. He had taken every dollar she possessed. He had packed up their 6 children and fled to Massachusetts, beyond the reach of Illinois courts. Under the law of coverture, he had broken no law. The property was his. The money was his. The children were his. Elizabeth Packard had won the most dramatic sanity trial in American history, and she had lost everything except the fact of her own freedom. She stood in the empty house. She had no money. She had no furniture. She had no children. She had a court verdict declaring her sane, and it was worth less than the paper it was printed on. The 7 minutes that freed her mind had not freed her life. For that, she would need a different kind of fight. Not a trial, a war. Not against one man, against the law itself. But before we follow Elizabeth into that war, we need to meet another woman, another prisoner, another son who decided his mother was too dangerous to be free. Chapter 5. The son who betrayed his mother. On the morning of May 19th, 1875, Mary Todd Lincoln had no idea that her only surviving son had assembled an army of lawyers and doctors to prove she was insane. She was living at the Grand Pacific Hotel in Chicago. She was 66 years old. She had survived more loss than most people could imagine. Her husband, the 16th President of the United States, had been murdered beside her in a theater box. She had held his head in her lap as his blood soaked her dress. That was 10 years before. In the decades since, she had lost 2 more sons. Edward had died of tuberculosis at 3. Willie had died of typhoid fever at 11. Thomas, called Tad, had died of pleurisy at 18. Of her 4 children, only 1 remained alive. Robert Todd Lincoln, her eldest, the one she trusted most. Robert was 31 years old and a rising attorney in Chicago. He moved in powerful circles. He was building a reputation. He was also, as the spring of 1875 progressed, building a case against his own mother. His stated concern was her spending. Mary had inherited a substantial estate, including approximately $56,000 in government bonds. She carried much of this wealth on her person, sewn into the lining of her petticoats and hidden in pockets she had designed herself. Robert believed this behavior was evidence of mental instability. He worried she would spend herself into poverty. But the spending was not the whole story. Mary had also begun to exhibit behaviors that alarmed her son. She told friends she could hear the dead speak to her. She attended seances, a common practice among the bereaved in Victorian America, but one that Robert found embarrassing. She made purchases that seemed impulsive. She bought curtains for a hotel room she did not own. She bought watches she did not need. Robert's response was not to talk to his mother. It was not to seek a family intervention or a private consultation with a physician. It was to assemble a legal machine designed to strip her of her autonomy in a single afternoon. He hired Leonard Swett, one of the most skilled trial lawyers in Illinois and an expert in insanity defense. On May 16th, 3 days before the confrontation, Swett convened a group of physicians and asked them to evaluate Mary Lincoln's sanity. None of them examined her directly. They based their conclusions entirely on information provided by Robert and by Dr. Willis Danforth, Mary's personal physician, who shared confidential details of her medical history without her knowledge or consent. The doctors agreed. Mary Todd Lincoln was insane. On the morning of May 19th, Sweat arrived at the Grand Pacific Hotel. He knocked on Mary's door. She opened it. He told her that she was required to appear in court immediately. She asked why. He told her the charge was insanity. She refused to go. Sweat told her, in language that left no room for ambiguity, that if she did not come willingly, uniformed police officers would arrive at her door, place her in handcuffs, and drag her through the hotel lobby in front of every guest and staff member in the building. Mary went. The trial lasted 3 hours. It was held in a Chicago courtroom before a jury of 12 men. 17 witnesses testified against her. They described her spending habits. They described the seances. They described her belief that a man had tried to poison her on a train. They described the bonds sewn into her clothing. A hotel maid testified that Mary had confided fears that Chicago was on fire again, a reference to the Great Fire of 1871 that had traumatized the entire city. A shopkeeper described purchases that seemed excessive. A physician who had never examined Mary took the stand and delivered a professional opinion of insanity based entirely on secondhand accounts. The entire proceeding was an ambush. And Mary had received no advance notice. She had been given no time to prepare. She had not been allowed to choose her own attorney. The trial had been scheduled, staffed, and choreographed by her son and his lawyer before she even knew it was happening. In a modern courtroom, every element of this process would be considered a violation of due process. In 1875, Chicago, it was perfectly legal. Her defense attorney was Isaac Arnold, an old friend of her late husband. Arnold called no witnesses on Mary's behalf. He did not cross-examine a single witness. He did not present a defense. He did not object to the proceedings. He sat at the defense table like a man who had already agreed to lose. Whether this was cowardice, corruption, or a prearranged agreement with Robert has been debated by historians for over a century. And the result was not in doubt. The jury found Mary Todd Lincoln insane. Within hours, she would be escorted to Bellevue Place, a private sanitarium in Batavia, Illinois, where she would be confined for an indeterminate sentence. But the trial was not the worst moment of that day. The worst moment came later, at the hotel. After the verdict, Mary was returned to the Grand Pacific under guard. She was to pack her belongings before being transported to Bellevue Place. When the guards were briefly distracted, she left her room. She walked downstairs to the hotel pharmacy. She asked the pharmacist for enough laudanum and camphor to kill herself. The pharmacist, who knew who she was, gave her a placebo. She drank it and waited to die. When death did not come, she returned to the pharmacy and asked for more. Again, he gave her a harmless substitute. The widow of Abraham Lincoln, the woman who had survived assassination and the death of 3 children, wanted to end her life rather than face the asylum. She did not die that night. Instead, she was taken to Bellevue Place. The door closed behind her. Her son had won. Her money, her freedom, and her dignity were now in his hands. But Mary Todd Lincoln was not finished. She was not even close to finished. Chapter 6. The Woman Who Wrote Her Way Out. From her private room at Bellevue Place Sanitarium, Mary Todd Lincoln did exactly what Elizabeth Packard had done 15 years earlier. She picked up a pen and began to plot. The parallels between these two women are almost too precise to be coincidence. Both were confined in Illinois. Both were imprisoned by the men closest to them. Now, both were told their sentences were indeterminate, and both chose the same weapon to fight back. They wrote, "Mary's situation at Bellevue Place was, on the surface, more comfortable than Elizabeth's at Jacksonville. Bellevue was a private institution catering to wealthy families. The rooms were furnished. The food was edible. The superintendent, Dr. Richard Patterson, treated Mary with a deference he would not have shown a patient of lesser means. She was allowed to walk the grounds. She was allowed visitors, though Robert controlled who could see her. But comfort is not freedom. Mary's mail was monitored. Her finances were controlled by Robert, who had been appointed her conservator by the court. She could not leave the grounds. She could not choose her own physician. She could not make a single decision about her own life. She was, maybe in every legal sense, a child again. And the man who held her leash was the son who had put her in chains. Mary understood something that many women in her position did not. She understood that the law could only hold her if it remained invisible. The moment the public learned what had been done to her, the moment her story reached the newspapers and the reformers and the politicians who had once courted her favor, the legal architecture would crack. She needed witnesses. She needed allies. She needed the press. She found all three in the same family. Judge James Bradwell and his wife Myra were reformers in Chicago. Myra Bradwell was a remarkable figure in her own right. She had passed the bar examination in Illinois and had been denied admission to practice law because she was a woman. She had fought the case all the way to the United States Supreme Court, which ruled against her in a decision that declared, with breathtaking condescension, that the natural and proper timidity and delicacy which belongs to the female sex evidently unfits it for many of the occupations of civil life. Myra Bradwell lost that case, but she did not stop fighting. She published a legal newspaper. She was connected to every reform movement in the state. And when she learned what Robert Lincoln had done to his mother, she was furious. Mary smuggled letters to the Bradwells. The letters were strategic. She did not write as a grieving woman. She wrote as a tactician. She described her confinement. She documented the conditions. She named the people involved. She asked for specific legal actions. Myra Bradwell acted fast. So she told a reporter at the Chicago Times that Mary Lincoln was no more insane than she was. The story exploded. Public sympathy swung hard toward the former First Lady. How could the son of Abraham Lincoln lock his mother in an asylum? How could the widow who had held a dying president be treated like a criminal? Robert scrambled. He had expected the commitment to be quiet, private, managed. He had not expected the press to take his mother's side. He had not expected Myra Bradwell. He attempted to intercept Mary's correspondence, to cut off the flow of information. But Mary had already sent too many letters. The campaign was in motion. Behind the scenes, Robert also tried to destroy evidence. He gathered his mother's letters from the period of her confinement and attempted to collect and eliminate every piece of correspondence that could be used against him. He was largely successful. Decades of Mary Todd Lincoln's letters were lost, and historians have long suspected that Robert burned them. But he could not burn the letters she had already placed in the hands of the Bradwells. The pressure worked. Within 4 months of her commitment, Mary had engineered her own release. On September 11th, 1875, she walked out of Bellevue Place. She had been confined for less than 4 months. It was the shortest involuntary commitment of a high-profile patient in Illinois history. And it happened because Mary Todd Lincoln had done what the system was designed to prevent. She had spoken. She had been heard. But the story did not end with her release. Mary's legal battle was only half won. She was free from the asylum, but the insanity verdict still stood. Her property was still controlled by Robert. She was still, in the eyes of the law, a lunatic. On June 15, 1876, a second jury convened in Chicago. This time, Mary had her own attorney. This time, witnesses testified on her behalf. This time, the system worked as it was supposed to work. The jury declared her restored to reason and capable to manage and control her estate. She had won everything: her freedom, her money, her legal identity. The victory was total. The cost was also total. The relationship between Mary and Robert never recovered. She looked at her only surviving child and saw the man who had locked her in a cage. He looked at his mother and saw a woman he believed was genuinely ill, a woman whose public campaign had humiliated him before the entire country. In a letter to a friend, Mary described Robert as one who had basely betrayed her for the sake of money. Robert maintained for the rest of his life that he had acted out of love. Mary made her choice. She sailed for Europe. She chose exile in France over the company of the son who had imprisoned her. She would spend years abroad, alone, the widow of the most famous president in American history, wandering through foreign cities because her own country had shown her what it could do to a woman who held her own money and spoke her own mind. The weapons she had used to free herself were the same weapons Elizabeth Packard had used: letters, allies, the press, the courts, and pen and paper against the full weight of the law. And both women had won. But the system that imprisoned them was still standing. And in the parlors and courtrooms of Gilded Age New York, another woman was about to discover that being a Vanderbilt did not protect you from the machine. Chapter 7. The Heiress Who Said, "Oh rats," in court. When Marie Wilmerding, great-granddaughter of Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, walked into the White Plains Courthouse in 1899, she was still technically a prisoner of the Bloomingdale Insane Asylum. She was not what the court expected. The physicians had described a broken woman, a lunatic too dangerous to be released into public life. What the judge saw instead was a young society woman in a tailored dress, sharp-eyed, quick-tongued, and visibly impatient with the men who claimed to own her future. Marie Wilmerding had the wrong last name and the right bloodline. She was the granddaughter of Vanderbilt Allen, the son of the Commodore, and she had inherited a share of the largest private fortune in American history. When Cornelius Vanderbilt died in 1877, he left behind roughly $100 million, an amount equivalent to billions in today's money. By the time that fortune had been carved up among children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, the individual shares were smaller but still vast. Marie's inheritance was enough to make her independent. And independence, for a Vanderbilt woman, was the most dangerous thing she could possess. The trouble began in Capri. Marie's father, Colonel Vanderbilt Allen, he had fallen gravely ill while traveling in Italy. Marie, frantic with worry, sold portions of her estate at a loss to fund an emergency transatlantic voyage to be at his side. She traveled fast and recklessly, sustaining herself on what she later described as stimulants and excitement. She barely slept. She spent money without counting it. She made decisions that were impulsive but entirely understandable for a daughter terrified of losing her father. Her relatives saw an opportunity. The Vanderbilt family operated by a set of rules that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with control. Fortunes of this size required management. Women who spent money independently were a threat to the collective wealth, and the legal tools available to manage that threat were the same tools that had been used against Elizabeth Packard and Mary Todd Lincoln: a family physician, a signed commitment order, an asylum. Marie was committed to the Bloomingdale Insane Asylum in White Plains, New York. The institution was a genteel prison for the wealthy, a place where the chandeliers were polished and the doors were just as firmly locked. Bloomingdale charged rates that only the richest families could afford, and it catered to a clientele that expected discretion. The walls were thick, the grounds were manicured, the patients were addressed politely. But the function was identical to Jacksonville or Blackwell's Island. It was a cage. The bars were simply better dressed. Her relatives assumed control of her estate. The money she had spent in Capri was cited as evidence of her incompetence. The stimulants she had used to stay awake during her journey were cited as evidence of addiction. Her grief over her father was cited as evidence of emotional instability. The logic was circular and airtight. Any action she had taken to save her father was reinterpreted as proof that she could not be trusted with her own fortune. Spending money was evidence of mania. Grieving was evidence of instability. Traveling alone was evidence of recklessness. Being a woman with a large inheritance was, in the end, the only evidence that mattered. Marie fought back the only way she could. She hired a lawyer. Getting a message to an attorney from inside Bloomingdale was itself an act of resistance. The institution controlled her mail, her visitors, and her access to the outside world. But Marie managed it, and the lawyer she found was willing to take on one of the most powerful families in America. Louis Levy stood before the court in White Plains and described his client as a friendless orphan whose relatives have immured her in an asylum without ever producing her for the court. He argued that Marie had never been examined by an independent physician. He argued that her commitment had been arranged by the very people who stood to profit from her confinement. He demanded her release. The asylum's physician took the stand. He testified with the grave authority of a man who believed his credentials placed him beyond question, that releasing Marie Wilmerding would be dangerous. She was unstable, he said. She was irrational. She was a threat to herself. Marie sat in the courtroom and listened to a doctor describe her as a lunatic. And then, in a moment that the newspapers would make famous, she blurted out 2 words. "Oh, rats!" The courtroom fell silent. Marie caught herself. She straightened in her chair and added, with a poise that undercut every word the physician had just spoken, "I really beg your pardon." It was a moment of dark comedy inside a machine designed to deny her voice. The doctor had described a woman on the edge of madness. The woman herself had just expressed in 2 syllables exactly what she thought of his diagnosis. The reporters scribbled furiously. The headline writers already had their story. Marie's case dragged through the courts. It did not resolve cleanly or quickly. The Vanderbilt family had resources that Elizabeth Packard and Mary Todd Lincoln could only have dreamed of, and they used those resources to fight Marie at every turn. But her case did something important. It proved that wealth did not protect a woman from the asylum. If anything, wealth made her more vulnerable. The larger the fortune, the greater the incentive to lock her away. The Commodore's empire had been built on railroads and ruthlessness. His descendants fought over the spoils with the same brutality he had used to build them. Inheritance disputes in the Vanderbilt family involved tens of millions of dollars and armies of lawyers. The commitment of inconvenient women was simply another tool in that arsenal, no different from a contested will or a bought judge. Marie Wilmerding said, "Oh, rats," in a courtroom in 1899, and the phrase became a symbol of something larger. It was the sound of a woman who refused to be silent in a system built to silence her. It was ridiculous and defiant and completely sane. And it echoed across the decades, joining the voices of Elizabeth Packard and Mary Todd Lincoln in a chorus that the Gilded Age could not drown out. But individual victories, however dramatic, were not enough. The system that had trapped these women was still intact. It would take a different kind of weapon to tear it down. Not a courtroom speech, not a smuggled letter, a newspaper. Chapter 8: 10 Days in a Madhouse. In the fall of 1887, a 23-year-old journalist named Nellie Bly checked herself into the women's lunatic asylum on Blackwell's Island, and what she found inside changed America. Elizabeth Cochran, who wrote under the pen name Nellie Bly, was working for Joseph Pulitzer's New York World when she proposed the assignment that would define her career. She would fake insanity, get herself committed to the city's most notorious asylum, and report from the inside. She was transported to Blackwell's Island in the East River, the sprawling institutional complex that housed the city's unwanted, the mentally ill, the poor, the criminal, and the inconvenient. What happened next exposed the closed logic of the asylum system. Once inside, Bly dropped her act completely. She behaved normally. She spoke clearly. She answered questions rationally. She told the staff she was not insane. It made no difference. The doctors noted her protests as further evidence of her condition. A patient who insisted she was sane was exhibiting delusion. A patient who behaved normally was showing cunning. The diagnosis created its own proof. There was no behavior inside the asylum that could not be interpreted as a symptom. The conditions Bly documented were medieval. Women sat on hard wooden benches for 14 hours a day in rooms with no heat. Ice water was poured over patients' heads as punishment for minor infractions. Bath water was shared among dozens of women, the same filthy tub refilled for patient after patient, with towels used by women with open sores handed to the next in line. The food was rancid, bread was stale, meat was spoiled. Women who complained were told they were imagining things. The scale of suffering was industrial. Blackwell's Island housed over 1,700 patients. The annual budget was approximately $575,000, roughly $340 per patient per year, a sum that paid for almost nothing beyond the bare minimum to prevent mass starvation. The ratio of nurses to patients was approximately 1 to 40. The nurses had no medical training. They were, in many cases, women recruited from the same poverty that had placed the patients in their care. But the most devastating finding was not the conditions. It was the patients themselves. Bly spoke with women on her ward and confirmed what Elizabeth Packard had documented decades earlier. Many of them were sane. One woman had been committed by a vindictive husband. Another was a German immigrant who spoke no English and had been declared insane because she could not answer questions in a language she did not understand. A third had been sent to the asylum by her family because she was difficult. Their crimes were poverty, foreignness, inconvenience, and the misfortune of being female in a system that required no evidence to lock them away. The Bly spent 10 days on Blackwell's Island before the world arranged her release. Her two-part series, published under the title 10 Days in a Madhouse, detonated across the country. The articles were specific. They named names. They described scenes with the precision of a prosecutor's brief. They told readers exactly what was happening on an island in the middle of their own city, funded by their own tax dollars. The power of Bly's reporting lay not just in the horrors she described, but in the simplicity of the question she posed. If a healthy, educated, English-speaking journalist could be committed to an asylum in a matter of hours, what hope did an immigrant woman have? What hope did a poor woman have? What hope did any woman have whose husband or family decided she was inconvenient? The ease with which Bly had entered the system proved that the system had no real gatekeeping at all. The doctors who examined her had spent mere minutes on the evaluation. The judge had taken even less time. The entire apparatus of diagnosis and commitment was a rubber stamp. It existed not to identify the insane, but to process the unwanted. Bly also documented something that struck at the heart of the asylum's supposed purpose. She noted that confinement itself made patients worse. Women who arrived anxious became terrified. Women who arrived confused became catatonic. The asylum did not treat mental illness. It manufactured it. The conditions were so degrading, the isolation so complete, that patients who entered with mild distress left, if they left at all, genuinely damaged by the experience of their own imprisonment. The response was immediate. A grand jury launched an investigation. Inspectors descended on Blackwell's Island. The city of New York increased the budget for public mental health care by $850,000, a massive infusion of funds that forced immediate improvements in conditions, staffing, and oversight. New regulations required independent medical examinations before commitment. The asylum itself was reorganized, and within 7 years of Bly's report, it was closed entirely. Nellie Bly had done something that individual legal battles could not. She had made the public see. Elizabeth Packard had fought the system in courtrooms. Mary Todd Lincoln had fought it through private correspondence and political allies. Bly fought it with the most democratic weapon available, a newspaper that reached hundreds of thousands of readers. She had pulled back the curtain on a system that depended on invisibility and exposed it to the full glare of public outrage. The asylum survived, but they could never again operate in total darkness. And in the wake of that exposure, a woman who had spent 3 years behind barred windows was about to finish the war she had started decades earlier. Chapter 9. The Law She Wrote with Her Own Hand. Elizabeth Packard did not stop at winning her own freedom. She spent the next 3 decades rewriting the laws of the nation that had imprisoned her. After the jury's 7-minute verdict in 1864, Elizabeth found herself free but destitute. Theophilus had taken everything: the children, the money, the house. She had won the right to be called sane, and she owned nothing but that right. Most women in her position would have disappeared into poverty. Elizabeth Packard chose a different path. She became a weapon. She wrote a book. Then she wrote another. Over the next several years, she published multiple volumes documenting her commitment, her treatment at Jacksonville, and the system that had made it all possible. She gave the books titles designed to provoke: The Prisoner's Hidden Life and Modern Persecution. She sold them herself, traveling from town to town, speaking at churches, courthouses, and public halls. She was not a natural performer. She was something more effective. She was an expert witness. Her argument was precise and devastating. The law, she told audiences across the country, allowed a husband to commit his wife to an asylum without evidence, without a hearing and without any legal protection whatsoever. This was not a loophole. It was the system working as designed, and it could be used against any married woman in the state of Illinois, your wife, your sister, your daughter. Any woman who displeased the man who controlled her legal existence could be made to disappear. In 1867, Elizabeth achieved her first legislative victory. The Illinois General Assembly passed a law requiring a jury trial before any person could be committed to an asylum against their will. This was not a minor reform. It was a demolition of the original statute, the 14-word clause that had given husbands absolute power. Under the new law, a woman accused of insanity had the right to appear before a jury, to hear the evidence against her, and to present witnesses in her defense. The asylum could no longer be used as a back door. It had to go through the front. But Illinois was one state. Elizabeth wanted the country. She traveled to Iowa, where she won passage of a law that became known as Packard's Law. It prohibited asylum officials from intercepting patients' mail. This was a strategic masterstroke. The single most effective tool the asylum system used to maintain control was isolation. Patients could not write to lawyers, journalists, or family members because their letters were confiscated by the institution that held them. Packard's Law broke that seal. A patient who could write a letter that actually reached the outside world was a patient who could fight back. She won reforms in Connecticut. She won reforms in Massachusetts. She won reforms in additional states, each time tailoring her campaign to the specific legal architecture of the state she was targeting. She did not fight the same battle everywhere. She studied the laws, identified the weakest points, and attacked. In some states, the key vulnerability was the absence of any medical examination requirement. In others, it was the lack of any appeal mechanism. Elizabeth mapped the legal terrain of each state the way a general maps a battlefield, and she chose her points of attack with a precision that left legislators no room to equivocate. Her methods were ahead of her time. She brought copies of asylum records to legislative hearings. She presented sworn testimony from former patients. She stood in the halls of state capitals and handed lawmakers her books, which contained page after page of documented abuses. She was not asking for sympathy. She was presenting evidence, and the evidence was overwhelming. Closer to home, she fought for and won passage of a married women's property law in Illinois. This struck at the root of the problem. Coverture was the foundation on which the entire system rested. If a married woman could own property in her own name, the financial incentive to commit her was diminished. If she could control her own assets, the husband who sent her to an asylum could not simply take what was hers. The property law did not end coverture entirely. That would take decades more of reform. But it cracked the foundation. It gave women a legal identity that existed separately from their husbands, and that identity was a shield. She also won back her children. The courts awarded her custody of her 3 younger children, a ruling that required Theophilus to return them from Massachusetts. It was a small, private victory inside a much larger public war, but it mattered. The children she had kissed goodbye on the morning the sheriff took her away were restored to her care. She financially supported them through her writing and speaking. She rebuilt a household from nothing. The broader reform movement that Elizabeth helped build was also fed by the cases that followed hers. Mary Todd Lincoln's public battle in 1875 created a new wave of outrage over the commitment process. Nellie Bly's reporting in 1887 provided the visual and emotional evidence that abstract legal arguments could not. And Marie Wilmerding's case in 1899 proved that the system was not limited to the poor or the obscure. It could swallow anyone, even a Vanderbilt. The scale of what these women were fighting against was enormous. Contemporary estimates suggest that across the United States, between 1850 and 1900, hundreds of women were confined in asylums on the word of a husband or male relative, with no independent medical evaluation and no legal recourse. The true number is almost certainly higher. Many cases were never documented. Many women never escaped to tell their stories. The asylum logbooks are full of names and dates and diagnoses, and behind each entry is a life that may have been stolen for nothing more than the crime of disagreement. By the turn of the century, 20 states had revised their commitment laws to include some form of due process protection. Jury trials, independent medical examinations, the right to legal representation, the right to communicate with the outside world. These were not gifts. They were victories won by women who had been through the machine and survived to describe its workings. But Elizabeth Packard knew something that the reformers who celebrated these victories sometimes forgot. The law is a fence, not a wall. It can be climbed. The practice of using medical diagnosis as a weapon of family control did not end with the Gilded Age. It adapted. It found new names, new institutions, new legal justifications. The machine was damaged, but it was not destroyed. The war she started in 1864 was far from over. Chapter 10. The Names on the Waiting List. For every Elizabeth Packard who fought back, there were 240 women on the waiting list at Jacksonville alone, and most of their names are lost. This is the chapter the Gilded Age would prefer you never hear. Not the story of the women who won, the story of the women who vanished. The asylum logbooks of the 19th century survive in state archives and university libraries. They are large, heavy volumes, their pages yellowed and brittle, their handwriting the careful script of clerks who recorded arrivals and departures with the same detachment a hotel ledger records guests. Name, date of admission, age, marital status, and then, in a column headed "Supposed Cause of Insanity," the reason the woman was sent away. The entries from the West Virginia Hospital for the Insane, covering the years between 1864 and 1889, are among the most complete surviving records. The causes listed for female patients read like a catalog of everything a 19th century woman was not supposed to do: novel reading, religious enthusiasm, domestic trouble, suppressed menstruation, excessive study, disappointed affection, overwork, uterine disease, political excitement. Each entry is a single line. Each line is a life. The woman committed for novel reading had a name and a face and a family. She may have had children who were told their mother was sick. She may have had property that was transferred to a husband or father the day she was admitted. She may have spent months or years inside an institution where no one asked whether she was actually ill because the question was irrelevant. The purpose of her commitment was not treatment. It was removal. The financial mechanics were brutal in their simplicity. When a woman was committed, her estate passed to the control of the male relative who had signed the papers. There was no oversight. No court reviewed how the money was spent. No accounting was required. If the husband who committed his wife spent her entire inheritance while she sat in an asylum, she had no legal recourse upon release, assuming she was ever released at all. The system was not merely indifferent to the financial exploitation of female patients. It was engineered to facilitate it. the numbers tell a story that individual cases cannot. In 1880, the United States Census counted over 91,000 patients in institutions for the insane. Women made up a slight majority of these patients nationwide, though the ratio varied by state. In private asylums, which catered to wealthier families, the proportion of women was often significantly higher. These were the institutions where the financial incentive to commit was greatest, where the weekly fees were highest, and where the families who paid those fees had the most to gain from keeping a relative confined. For every Elizabeth Packard who smuggled letters through a window, there were dozens of women who never found an ally on the other side. For every Mary Todd Lincoln who had the fame to command newspaper coverage, there were hundreds of women whose names appeared only in the logbook, a single line of ink in a volume that no one read. The asylum was not a hospital, it was a vault, and the women inside it were the deposits. Their names are mostly lost. Their stories survive only in the bureaucratic shorthand of admission records and discharge logs. But they were real. They lived. They were someone's mother, someone's daughter, someone's wife. And they were put away not because they were sick, but because they were inconvenient. The system that swallowed them was not a conspiracy. It was something worse. It was ordinary. It operated in daylight, with legal sanction, with medical authority, with the full cooperation of courts and families and communities. It did not hide because it did not need to. It was the way things worked. Until the women who escaped started telling the truth about what was inside. Chapter 11. The Diagnosis That Never Dies. The word hysteria comes from the Greek word for uterus, and for 2,000 years, it was the medical establishment's favorite explanation for any woman who refused to be quiet. The ancient Greeks believed that a woman's uterus could wander through her body, pressing on organs and producing symptoms that ranged from anxiety to convulsions. The diagnosis survived the collapse of Rome, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and the Enlightenment. It arrived in the 19th century not as a relic, but as a living tool, refined and sharpened by each generation of physicians who needed a label for the problem of female defiance. By the 1830s, the toolkit had expanded. Dr. James Cowles Pritchard, an English physician, invented the diagnosis of moral insanity in 1835. It was a masterpiece of medical weaponry. Moral insanity did not require delusions. It did not require hallucinations. It did not require any cognitive impairment of any kind. It required only behavior that was deemed socially deviant. A woman who spent money in ways her family disapproved of. A woman who expressed opinions her husband found offensive. A woman who refused to perform the duties expected of her sex. All of these could be diagnosed as morally insane without any evidence of actual mental illness. The diagnosis was a blank check. It could be filled in with any behavior that made a woman inconvenient. Now, a doctor visiting a girls' boarding school in 1858 wrote that the institution appeared to be training your girls for the lunatic asylum. His concern was that the students were studying too much, reading too many books, developing opinions. These activities, he warned, could produce eccentricity of conduct that would inevitably be labeled as moral insanity. The treatment was to return to natural feminine behavior, domesticity, obedience, and silence. The vocabulary shifted across the decades, but the logic never changed. Monomania was used to describe women with strong opinions on a single subject. Hysteria was applied to women who displayed strong emotions. Neurasthenia was the diagnosis for women who were tired of the lives they were forced to live. So each label achieved the same result: It transformed a social problem into a medical one. A woman who wanted a divorce was not unhappy. She was diseased. A woman who wanted to control her own money was not independent. She was delusional. A woman who wanted to read or think or speak was not exercising her humanity. She was exhibiting symptoms. The tools evolved alongside the diagnoses. In the 19th century, the treatments included confinement, cold water immersion, forced feeding, chemical sedation, and surgical intervention. In the 20th century, the tools became more sophisticated, but no less destructive. Insulin shock therapy, electroconvulsive therapy, lobotomy. The case of Rosemary Kennedy haunts this history like a ghost. In 1941, Joseph Kennedy authorized a prefrontal lobotomy on his 23-year-old daughter. Rosemary was described by the family as mentally retarded and difficult. She had mood swings. She sometimes wandered at night. She was, by the accounts of friends and teachers, a young woman of below-average intelligence but genuine warmth and capability. The lobotomy destroyed her. She was left unable to speak coherently, unable to walk properly, unable to care for herself. She was institutionalized for the remaining 63 years of her life. The family kept her existence a secret for decades. Rosemary Kennedy was not committed because she was insane. She was committed because she was inconvenient. The diagnosis and the procedure changed. The underlying logic did not. A powerful family, a daughter who did not conform, a medical system willing to provide the tools of control. The 19th century gave us the asylum. The 20th century gave us the lobotomy. The machinery adapts. It does not disappear. The uncomfortable truth that connects the Gilded Age to the modern era is not that the specific abuses continued. Commitment laws were reformed. Asylum conditions improved. Medical standards changed. The uncomfortable truth is that the impulse survived. The belief that a woman's independence is a symptom. The instinct to reach for a diagnosis when a woman refuses to comply. The tendency to treat female anger, female ambition, female autonomy as conditions to be treated rather than rights to be respected. The Greek word for uterus is hystera. The diagnosis it spawned lived for 2 millennia. The women it was used against are still counting the cost. Chapter 12. The woman they could not silence. On August 10, 2023, the state of Illinois removed the name of Dr. Andrew McFarland from its Springfield Mental Health Center and replaced it with the name of the woman he had tried to break. 163 years. That is how long it took. From the morning in 1860 when the sheriff arrived at Elizabeth Packard's door to the afternoon when the governor of Illinois stood at a podium and announced that the McFarland Mental Health Center would henceforth be known as the Elizabeth Packard Mental Health Center. 163 years between the crime and the correction. The ceremony was modest by the standards of state government. A handful of officials, a few descendants, a new sign on a building, but the symbolism was absolute. The state that had imprisoned Elizabeth Packard for the offense of having opinions was now naming a public institution in her honor. The doctor who had kept her locked away, who had written in his own records that she was sane and had confined her regardless, had his name stripped from the wall and replaced with hers. Elizabeth Packard did not live to see it. She died on July 25th, 1897, in Chicago, at the age of 81. In the 33 years between her release and her death, she had published multiple books, won reforms in more than 30 states, secured passage of married women's property laws, and built a national movement for the rights of patients and women. She had started with nothing. After the 7-minute verdict, she had owned nothing but the clothes she stood in and the papers she had hidden from the asylum staff. She rebuilt her life word by word, speech by speech, legislature by legislature. She supported herself and her children through her writing and speaking. She never remarried. She never reconciled with Theophilus, who died in 1885. Mary Todd Lincoln's ending was quieter and more bitter. After her release from Bellevue Place and the second jury's restoration of her legal rights, she sailed for Europe and spent 4 years in exile. She returned to the United States in 1880 and moved into the home of her sister, Elizabeth Edwards, in Springfield, Illinois. The same house where she had married Abraham Lincoln 40 years earlier. She was in poor health. Her eyesight was failing. She lived in a darkened room on the 2nd floor, surrounded by trunks of clothing and possessions she refused to unpack. Robert visited rarely. The rift between mother and son never closed. Mary died on July 16, 1882, at the age of 63. The cause of death was listed as a stroke. She died in her sister's house, in the city where she had been a young bride, estranged from the only child who survived her. Marie Wilmerding faded from the historical record. After the court proceedings that made headlines in 1899, her name disappeared from the society pages. The Vanderbilt fortune continued to be fought over by descendants who used every legal and institutional tool available to control its distribution. Marie's "Oh rats" became an anecdote, repeated in drawing rooms and newspaper retrospectives as a moment of comic defiance. What happened to her afterward, whether she recovered her estate, whether she lived freely, whether she found peace, is largely unrecorded. The Gilded Age had a short memory for women who made trouble, but the legal reforms these 3 women fought for endured. The jury trial requirement that Elizabeth Packard won in Illinois in 1867 became the model for commitment reform across the country. The male protection she won in Iowa gave future patients a weapon that could not be confiscated. The public outrage that Mary Todd Lincoln's case generated forced a national conversation about who had the right to define insanity and who had the power to enforce that definition. And Nellie Bly's reporting proved that journalism could be a battering ram against institutional walls that legal proceedings alone could not breach. By 1900, 20 states had adopted some form of due process protection for patients facing involuntary commitment. The practice of committing women on a husband's signature alone had been outlawed in most jurisdictions. Independent medical examination was required. Legal representation was guaranteed. The machine had been damaged, not destroyed, damaged, slowed, forced into the light. The story these women told, and the story this documentary has tried to reconstruct, is not a story about mental illness. It is a story about power, about who gets to define normal, about who gets to control money, about what happens when a woman's independence is treated not as a right, but as a disease. In the Gilded Age, a woman could be erased by a single signature: a husband, a father, a son. One name on one piece of paper, and a life could be folded up and filed away in an asylum where no one would hear her scream, or read her letters, or ask whether she belonged there at all. Elizabeth Packard, Mary Todd Lincoln, and Marie Wilmerding refused to be erased. They wrote. They fought. They turned the machinery of the law against the men who had used it to cage them. They did not merely survive. They left marks so deep that 163 years later, a state government still felt the need to acknowledge what had been done. The Gilded Age tried to bury this story, the wealth, the institutions, the diagnoses, the locked doors. All of it was designed to keep these women silent. And every word of this story is proof that the design failed. They could not be silenced. And now, neither can the truth.